I think with all of this, I think we end with the understanding that how individualistic we've become and isolated from each other and isolated. That's why I was saying that the whole system is caught up in this whole thing of maintaining things as they are, but things as they are no longer healthy or in our best interests as a society and as communities and people. And we find that it's whether it's mental health or emotional health or social problems, a lot of it is rooted in this form of individualism that we're living and this social organization that we have that is isolating us from any sort of responsibility towards each other and society, or the society to the individual. It really has showed itself to be a culmination of years and years of decline. Where the ethics that have been, like, I remember how when drugs came in, which that was a legal issue that unfortunately the system had allowed those drugs to come in. But those drugs coming in destroyed our neighborhoods, destroyed the fabrics of our neighborhoods. And it has continued to today's time. Maybe it's not necessarily cocaine, but it's meth now. We have whole communities that are wrecked, heroin, meth, Percocets, all that, pills, everything. It has a lot to do with the way that we have structured our economy.
For sure.
It's exploited. We're exploiting each other, for profit. And what it does is it creates an environment of breakdown. And people may be on one side for a short period of time until it hits home. When it hits your child, when it hits your brother, when it hits your sister, when it maybe hits your husband or wife or your grandchild or your neighbor or your cousin, then we start taking on a different angle. But that's just where we're at. You know what I'm saying? This is where we're at in this society. I don't know if, like, a lot of I look at the situation, like, for instance, of when we talk about the way that we're doing policing, if this, when this starts spilling over into certain segments of European American communities, they take a hold, and that has happened. It's happened in some states where the engagement of the police with European Americans has changed people's outlook on how policing is done as being problematic. And it's not only the issue of policing, but it's also the issue of economics, the way poverty is striking our communities. And it's also the issue of, for instance, like when we talk about the issue of drugs, mental health, we're just at a point where we need to rethink things. That's where I'm at. I'm at a point where I think that we need to rethink things. I think the Muslims themselves have to pause. It's not just an issue of saying that we're Muslim, and because we're Muslim, we're the best type of concept. That's a religious type of arrogance, because that's not the concept of kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. The idea is that you have the best of tools and you have a set of experiences that allows you to be able to give back to society and call to that which is good and prohibit that which is problematic or that which is harmful to people. But I don't think, even as Muslims, I don't even think that we have an understanding of what our role is. That's why I was saying to you, like, what do you think our role is? And I have my own biases in all this, but I've been trying to hold back on how I'm looking at things, whether it's the issue of government or race relations or economics. But I definitely think that there's some sort of, rethinking that needs to be, and that's why I was asking you, what do you think, our role is in all of this?
It's not called Ahlu Sunnah wal Infirad. It's called Ahlu Sunnah wal Jama'ah, right? Islam is about the Jama'ah, the group, the community, the ummah, right? It's a communal worldview. And I think we forget that a lot in the West.
I don't think we forget that. I think it has been chipped away post 9/11. I think pre 9/11, the idea of ummah in community somewhat was maybe at times problematic. It had its own problems to it, but it had some good as well. But I think post 9/11, I think that the reality is that that concept has been chipped away. The idea of community, or even the idea of aiming at community. What we're seeing more is like aiming at building a nonprofit or a masjid. That is the idea of community that people have. It's not community. So I think it has been chipped away. But how essential do you think that is to Islamic teaching and belief across the different sects and historically and everything, the idea of community?
I feel like Islamic law is geared with a communal outlook that, you know, your actions, how they affect other people matters a lot. We all have rights over each other. We all have huquq over each other. You know, that's why we have this whole huge section of fiqh called mu'amalat, right? How do we deal with one another in society, right? And there's supposed to be a bedrock of what you might call social welfare to take care of one another. You know,
it's funny that you bring that up, because in reality, I was listening to those brief talks, like a talk for dummies type of approach, where they basically simplify a complicated topic. And I was listening to a talk similar to that style of just trying to clarify knowledge in a very succinct, clear way, or elucidate it in a very succinct manner. There was a talk on Catholic social teaching, and I used to listen to this stuff in some way or form when I was a Catholic. But it was interesting after all these years to come and revisit that. And what you were saying is something that's very clear, within Catholic social teaching. And I bring it up because it's important to show that there's common ground across different communities on certain values, right? And this idea of the collective, this idea of considering the poor, right? This idea of rights and responsibility, those are three highlight points that were brought up in Catholic social teaching. Also, the issue of economics, the issue of environment are other points that were brought up. The issue of human dignity, right? That's something that was brought up as well. And so these are all principles that I was looking at them, and I would say, well, Islam affirms all of that. Everything that was said there, the conclusion is affirmed by Islam. There may be some slight points of difference on details, but even with that, on a lot of those issues, there's some overlap. And I think that what we're missing as Muslims is that succinct presentation on our social teachings. You understand what I'm saying? So that others can understand where they can meet us on what ground. A lot of times we're doing this interfaith work, but in reality is being done sometimes by members from our community, which are trying to find their place in American society. They're not necessarily interested in finding common ground to build the community together, right? And so I think that spelling out for society, some of the principles that we're operating from, it allows us to be, at home. Just like I'm pretty sure the activist community, when they saw the Muslims involved, with the George Floyd incident, they were like, oh yeah, the Muslims are involved, because that's, Muslims are standoffish on these types of issues in many instances.
I think they were quite surprised and shocked in a good way. They were happy, pleasantly surprised about it, because, historically in Minneapolis, when the Somali immigrants started coming in the 90s, there was a lot of tension between African-American slave descendants of the enslaved, and the Somali community. You go to like any high school and it was constant fights and battles. The Somali gangs were rivals with the black gangs. Somalis say, we're not African-American, we're not black, we're not like you, we're African. And it was this kind of very tense, standoffish mentality. That's been obliterated now. Now it's together. We're all black. We're all viewed the same by the police. We all got to stick together and do something about this.
But to be fair to the situation, that sort of tension has been there with every ethnic group.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, in Philadelphia, that was there between the European Americans and the African Americans and the Puerto Ricans. It was there. That it was there between the Irish and the Italian. It's not to downplay, but I think that this is, these are issues that we have in this society of how different ethnic groups relate to each other. Mm-hmm. And we know that the whole gang culture originated between the different European groups, whether it was the Irish and the Italians and
gangs in New York, that movie.
And I think that, and unfortunately, that's why I was saying that our vision of society and how we deal with each other, a lot of times it creates that insider-outsider culture. And rather than it being like, for instance, at one point, they say, there's a Christian value on welcoming the stranger. But immigration rights had to be fought for on the streets with the civil rights movement. You know what I'm saying? The African-American community and allies, they really were at the forefront of that. But we as a society have not adopted, a real sound way of how we're going to deal with all of these issues. And I think that that's where the breakdown is. I think that the whole concept of good citizenship that was being taught at schools, within the last decade or so, was a quiet recognition that we have internally broken down. We're imploding, and so that there's a need for reorienting people so that they know what their responsibility is to society. But most of the time, is about conformity. It's not about like what John Dewey was saying education is for direct, democratic participation in the society, so that people take a responsibility for themselves and for their communities. That's I think that's more of a John Dewey-esque way of looking at education. But I want the Muslims, I would like that we begin to articulate these points more and more. I don't think that we can wait. I don't think that what's coming from the suburban Muslim community is a good representation, of where we should be at, because I think that what they're playing an identity game. They're playing, where do I fit at in my identity? I made it to this particular space in government, but you didn't earn your space in the community. You see what I'm saying? Like, what community service did you do? You may have gotten the education. Others have fought for equality and openness and inclusion, and that brings in this group, which I'm not saying that's necessarily bad in itself, but we're not seeing a certain segment of the Muslim community earn their keep in really living the social problems so that they can participate to fix them. This is more of like almost like my CV looks good, so I'm being, allowed to come into this circle. And so what ends up happening is that the outlook that's being shaped on how we deal with politics is one of those outlooks which is just about safeguarding, a certain class of interest.
Yeah, I feel it's a very, bourgeoisie way of thinking about who's qualified to speak and who has the epistemic right to be up here talking. And it marginalizes the inner city and rural Muslims. I think they look at these people as, arrogant snobs, really, frankly, because they haven't been there to see how people really live. They haven't been there to see the real struggles. They haven't been out in the streets trying to do the work, the work on the ground. They just want to come and pontificate to people. That's the impression,
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think that is the reality. And again, you brought up an excellent point. It's not too different than national leaders that are given platforms that don't have any tie into communities being the spokespeople. It's not too different. Like, we keep coming back to that problem. Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? That gap between experience and actual tie-in and commitment to communities. It is where a lot of the narratives are co-opted on multiple levels. And then once the narrative is co-opted, the real work is not done, because, the narrative is supposed to be there to support the work. So that narrative that's co-opted, it becomes the dominant narrative for how people understand what is happening and how things should be. So people lose their voice. And again, that takes out the whole concept of participatory democracy, where people have their own voice and they're able to articulate themselves and what it is that they need.
Yeah, you know, I mean, if people want to look in to like the local activists here, you know, look at the Black Lives Minnesota, you know, page on Facebook, or Black Lives St. Paul, Black Lives Minneapolis. You know, a prominent activist here locally is Nikema Levy Armstrong. You know, she's been a law professor here locally, and one of the biggest activists, you know, since like 2014. But I feel like a lot of times the national media has completely ignored her, and she's been a big leader here, you know, and it's,
you know, you bring up an important point, and this point has been talked about by Chomsky, has been talked about by Edward Said. And actually, I witnessed this problem with one of my professors. His name was Dr. James Fenelon, who's from the Lakota movement, and he was part of those scholars who were doing research on Native American issues. And he was actually, I believe he was fired from my school, and they called him an activist and not a researcher, because at that time in Cleveland, Ohio, he was protesting against Chief Wahoo, where the Chief Wahoo symbol was the symbol of the Cleveland Indians, which is, you know, basically a distorted image of an Indian person, redskin type of concept. And so, you know, that he was like that, what we call in Islam, the scholar activist, you know, that type of concept. You know, that's something that, you know, you yourself play those dual roles. And it's not, you know, it's not an accolade type of thing. It's more of a lifestyle. And
my 24/7.
Yeah, and so that's what I was going to ask you. For the indigenous Muslims, how do you see that concept? Because before we had the Imam activists, right? We had the Imam activists. But we've seen that mix between the Imam activists and the scholar activist, or the public intellectual, and people like Malcolm X and so on and so forth. And, you know, that is exactly what Edward Said and even Chomsky, they were talking about, you know, these roles, how they've been missing in the society. The public intellectual, maybe not so much on the activism side. You know, I was a student of Habermas. You know, Habermas, the German philosopher. And in Germany,
with the public square, right?
Yeah. Jürgen Habermas, one of the things that he had in his, you know, the Europeans from Europe, the Europeans have more of a role for the intellectual in the public forum, even on radio shows, on TV shows. Like Jürgen Habermas was one of those types of people that on TV, he would come on similar to the Muslim scholar that comes on the satellite dish, or the Muslim TV scholar in Egypt, you know what I'm saying, that's being interviewed. And so there's more of a direct
Foucault was like that on TV too.
Like, even when you look at Al-Azhar has a radio program, their own, not a radio show, but a program that has a series of shows, or station, I should actually say, to be more correct. And their programming, they have scholars that come. It's like a people's university, you know, where that scholar comes and educates them on issues that are high level, but in a language that the people learn how to understand. They don't have to have the technicality, but they learn it. They don't have to go to school for years. And so for us, like we're in the process of remaking ourselves, bro. So the issue is, like, for the Muslim intellectual, the Muslim activist scholar, how do you see that role? Because you yourself are already formulating that role for yourself, you know, in terms of the living it out. It's not necessarily something that's theoretical.
Intentional thing, you know, it just is what it is.
Yeah, it's organic. Like it's an organic development. And I have some experience. I don't have a lot of experience, but I have some experience with this issue of being involved. And I will say that that type of leadership is taxing, to be involved. You're on the relief side, you're on the activism side, you're on the intellectual side, you're on the, community support side. You're trying to play religious, guide, so to speak. It is, we just don't have a lot of those type figures, right? If you were to give that type of persona more platform, then you would start having like maybe more Malcolm X's, more Martin Luther King's. You would start having those priests that are on the front line, those pastors that are on the front line. You would start having more people like that. So how do you see this developing itself out? This identity.
One of the things that I've noticed here locally in Minnesota is that a lot of the Jewish and Christian leadership, intellectual leadership, who are also activists, have excluded Muslims from their activism. And I don't think it was necessarily intentional, but we don't have those relationships. And I think this is common around the country. We need to work more on kind of building relationships with the broader, larger community in that regard. And I think we also, we have to be well-grounded, of course, in our own tradition, in our own epistemology, our own ways of thinking, but we can't let that make us afraid of learning about others and other systems. We can look at the Nation of Islam as a model for organization. We can look at the Black Panthers and what they did as a model and subsume that under an Islamic worldview. We can look at books like this one, the End of Policing by, Alex Vitale, and think about, okay, how do these ideas work with Islam? How do they work with what Imam Ghazali said about police brutality and the alchemy of happiness, and so on and so forth? Like, how can we think about these things and contribute not only just to our own community, but America at large, the West at large, the world at large?
I don't think that type of work is, I think that type of work has to come from us, the indigenous Muslims. I think that because it is, whether we like it or not, this is our, our culture. Like, we knew this before we knew, the Muslim community or Islam. And this is where I was saying that this becomes a certain type of responsibility. I think what happens is that now, with certain segments of the Muslim community coming into position and privilege in the system, our voices are being technically marginalized. Now, on another note, going back to the issue that you were saying, you were talking about the relationship of the Muslim community and the Jewish and Christian circles. Honestly, the Muslims in many instances are not prepared to go into those circles. You do have some imams that have done it, like Imam Talib Abdul Rashid in New York from MIB. And there's another imam, a Lebanese Palestinian, I forget his name right now. He's doing it as well in Oklahoma. He's kind of involved. But the language is not there. Like, remember I was saying how Catholic social teaching is clear? Muslims are debating on issues of systemic racism. You have whole segments of the Muslim community having taken on a neoconservative, neo-Nazi understanding of that. And so then you have another segment that has gone so far left in the understanding that they don't know where they stand. And it's not necessarily a good left. It's not like a principled left. It's more of like a loose, faddish type of just regurgitating what people say without really digesting.
A kind of anti-intellectual post-modern left is kind of how I want to think about it.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it. It's just like trendy. And in those circles, I've been in those circles. I had the privilege in New Jersey of participating in that type of activity with the Jewish and Christian community. And they have their own organizational language. They have their own way of dealing with things. They come together. They have their own agreements. Muslims, that's why I was saying that interfaith, the way that interfaith is done, Jews and Christians, they disagree with each other on fundamental issues. Like who God is. They disagree with each other on that.
Yep.
But when it comes to saying that, okay, we have this common ground between each other, they will acknowledge that to a certain extent. Maybe they differ sometimes on the whole issue, of certain, I think that the Muslims are more scared that in going into these circles in some sort of brotherly way, will entail that they will have to adopt the party line. And I think that the party line means for many of the Muslims right now, it means, adopting LGBT, stances, policies that are favorable to LGBT, and other issues, for instance, abortion and all, and open abortion stances. Some of the things that you're finding in some circles and some religious communities, some Muslims find to be problematic, right? Some Muslims find it to be extremely problematic. And I think that's why I said the language is not there, nor the identity, nor the way of dealing with these spaces in a way where you can function with them and be on your own. There is a fear that engagement at that level will be a compromise in religiosity for many leaders. Another thing is that it's like one brother told me, I go to all of these interfaith groups, but I am not any man. And I'm dealing with rabbis and I'm dealing with pastors. He's not even trained.
These are people who got masters and PhDs in divinity.
Yeah. And that's part of the dilemma. That's why I was saying that in a lot of ways, the Muslims are behind educationally. And they don't necessarily have to have the titles, but the articulation points, many of the Muslims are not there. And if they do the interfaith stuff, or if they come into those platforms, many times it's more for political correctness and navigating what they have determined to be the Islamophobia platform than it is to actually aligning and allying for social transformation or change. The Jewish and the Christian community, when I participated in Jersey, they were directly interested in getting the governor to change legislation. You know what I'm saying? They were not, they were, and the legislation had to do with local concerns. So some of the Muslim organizations are beginning to join that, but it's more symbolic than it is actual commitment. Like they're not, like the Muslims are not the ones on the front line, entertaining these ideas or putting them forward. The creative element.
We're afraid to sacrifice.
Yeah, the sacrifice is not there. There's
the kafara element of our religion, the expiation for doing good deeds like this, it's missing. That's how I feel about it. Like, I feel like it's like a lack of self-confidence. We don't have the guts to be ourselves. There's this famous kind of saying, be yourself, they'll adjust. And we've seen that with the GOP and the Trump phenomena. He was being himself and they adjusted, right? I think when it comes to being in interfaith spaces, these are other religious people who have principles, who have beliefs, who disagree with each other. They're not going to expect you to agree with them on everything. They're going to know you got principles, you got your own convictions, and they respect that. And I think Muslims don't realize, hey, you will be respected for being yourself and being true to your convictions. You don't have to agree with everything. You don't have to be politically correct or blah, 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 blah. Right? If you have common goals, you're going to work together to achieve those common goals, right? You be cordial with each other, khalas, let's get it done. I don't see what the holdup is.
I think the right people are not in place.
It's true, yeah.
That's what I was saying. That's what I was saying, that I personally believe that the converts need to shift gears and really focus on their own leadership, internal development, and stop depending on outside of the convert community for its own development. 100%. There's things that we can collaborate on, but I think that getting to this level, because we're at the end of the day, we're still at this is going to entail that we're dealing with our uncles, our aunts, our cousins, our parents that are in these positions. You see what I'm saying?
So my aunt's a Minneapolis Police Department sergeant.
Yeah, and that's what, and this is the issue that I'm saying, that's a different level of engagement and responsibility versus someone that is their origins are not really rooted in the society, and it's not a point of divisiveness or whatever. It's just a fact. You know what I'm saying? This is just a social fact, and this is why I say when the narrative is a narrative which doesn't speak to those realities, is a narrative which is imposed upon us and it marginalizes, because it doesn't allow us to even engage our own. We're being told what Islam is, and how Islam tells us to engage our own relatives. When we're not at that point, we're at a point where we can actually go and research ourselves. You understand what I'm saying? What is a better course of action to engage our relatives in our society, which is completely different. Like, this is the American Muslim community is one of the largest communities that has converts. You know, that's a different phenomenon when you do comparative community studies. Like if you were to look at England or Australia or other countries, right? The Muslims in the US have large amounts of converts from US society itself that generationally have been here for years. So, but that community has allowed itself to not grow properly and develop itself to be able to talk about shaping the narrative or the role. And so the system itself has opted to select certain people from the middle and the upper classes, so to speak, you know, and those become the representatives or the voices for what Islam is. That's why, for instance, when we talk about this case, you know, the George Floyd case, and when we start talking about the stores, you know, that's a topic that is not even really understood by many of the Muslim, you know, community members that we have, you know, because they themselves are not, that's not their reality.